With that, Deputy Commissioner, I appreciate you giving me the time to read that into the record. You may proceed. Thank you.
Good morning. Chairman Grisanti and Senator Gallivan, thank you very much for this opportunity to testify about wastewater and cuttings that result from natural gas extraction using high-volume hydraulic fracturing, also referred to by the initials HVHF. My name is Gene Leff. I'm a Deputy Commissioner at DEC. Commissioner Martin sends his regrets that he was unable to be here today.
Okay.
For nearly 4 years, DEC has been intensively studying the potential environmental impacts of the use of high-volume hydraulic fracturing to extract natural gas from shale formations in New York State. We just completed 4 public hearings on the revised draft supplemental generic environmental impact statement, referred to as the SGEIS, that would govern natural gas exploration using this process, and we have received more than 14,000 comments already on the draft. We previously received approximately 13,000 comments on an earlier draft in 2009. The latest draft builds on and greatly improves upon the 2009 draft. We learned much from the experience in other states, as well as from insights offered by commenters. As a result, we have identified many measures to protect our drinking water, our air, our land, and our streams. We have added significant protections recommended by scientists, engineers, and our colleagues at the Department of Health to ensure that any gas drilling that takes place is undertaken in a manner that protects public health and the environment. The SGIS fully examines the potential environmental impacts of wastewater that will result from high-volume hydraulic fracturing, as well as the potential impacts of cuttings generated by drilling in deep wells anticipated to be used for the development of the Marcellus and Utica shales. As its name indicates, high-volume hydraulic fracturing uses large volumes of water combined with certain chemicals and proppants to, quote, stimulate a geologic formation and free the natural gas for extraction. DEC anticipates that each individual well will be fractured using between approximately 2 and 8 million gallons of water. After the pressure is released of fracturing, the fracturing fluid that returns to the surface is known as flowback water. And in the slide that you can see on the side, we have 2 columns, one referring to flowback water, and we'll be talking about production brine in the other column a bit later. Flowback water is typically recovered within the first 2 or 3 weeks after fracturing, and of the total volume of flowback, as much as 60% returns within the first 4 days. DEC has estimated that between 216,000 and 2.7 million gallons of flowback per well would be generated. Next slide, please. Data reported by the Susquehanna River Basin Commission, the SRBC, confirms that less water than may have been previously anticipated returns to the surface after fracturing is completed. The SRBC data indicate that only roughly 8% of the total fluid volume is recovered. In addition to less water being returned, gas companies are now recycling most of the flowback water. Recycling includes the removal of metals from the flowback water, either on-site or at a centralized facility. The recycled water is combined with fresh water, and the fracturing fluid mixture is adjusted based on the chemical makeup of the wastewater and then used again in a fracturing process. Next slide. All wastewater generated at a well site will be required under our SGEIS to be collected in steel tanks, and we have a slide on the left of this slide are steel tanks of the type that I'm referring to. This was deemed necessary to prevent the risk of spills and to reduce or eliminate air pollution from volatile organic chemicals found in flowback water. And you may have read, Senators, of complaints in other states of air pollution near well pads. Frequently, this resulted from the use of open-air impoundments for wastewater, which would not be utilized in New York State. If an operator seeks to store flowback in an impoundment in a centralized location to serve multiple well pads, this could be an exception. It would be subject to site-specific review, and discretionary approval process would be necessary, as well as an individual permit for the construction of the impoundment under our Speedies law. The tanks used for flowback water would be required to be removed from the site within specific time frames shortly after fracturing operations are completed. The tanks are required to have secondary containment to protect against tank or equipment failures, spills, leaks, or fluid releases. The well pads themselves will be subject to engineered stormwater controls. In addition, DEC has proposed a series of buffer distances between the edge of the well pad and sensitive resources. Over time, water from the target formation is produced with natural gas and returns up the well bore. This water is commonly referred to as produced water or production brine. And the slide we're now showing again shows on the right some of the characteristics of production brine and how we intend to treat it. Produced water volume or production brine is highest in the first 15 to 90 days after hydraulic fracturing and then decreases over time. It is very salty and contains a high concentration of total dissolved solids. Produced water may also have naturally occurring radioactive materials known as NORM, which may contribute to the buildup of scale on production equipment. If that occurs at certain levels as determined by the Department of Health, a radioactive materials handling license will be required, primarily for the protection of workers. In the Susquehanna River Basin, of 1.6 billion gallons of fresh water delivered to well pads in the basin, only 42 million gallons, or 2.6%, required disposal, according to the SRBC. That's because so much of the water is being either retained in the geologic formations deep in the ground or being reused or recycled in the process. Although the volume of wastewater which requires disposal is expected to be reduced as a result of recycling, there still will be significant quantities of wastewater that will be generated, and as to this, DEC will not issue any permit for drilling until it is satisfied that the wastewater will be sent to a properly permitted facility either here in New York or in other states. Applicants will have to provide DEC with their disposal plans before any drilling permit is issued, including contingency disposal plans. At this point in time, besides recycling, the disposal methods anticipated to be proposed for both flowback water and produced water are injection and disposal injection into disposal wells or processing at water treatment plants. And here we are showing in the slide some of the main requirements for wastewater treatment plant, WWTP, approval. But before I address that, first I want to refer to the disposal well option. These are frequently used in other states, including Ohio and Texas, but they are uncommon in New York. Disposal wells must be permitted, if they are proposed, by both EPA and DEC. They would require a site-specific review under our seeker law in New York, and that's been our state's policy since at least 1992 for oil, gas, and solution mining issues. However, disposal of wastewater at a well permitted in another state is an acceptable means of disposal as well. For a wastewater treatment plant to receive any new waste stream, including flowback water or production brine, it must go through a long-standing review process pursuant to the Clean Water Act and the State Pollution Discharge Elimination System, SPEEDIES, program, which requires a permit. Any plants that wish to accept flowback would have to have a DEC or EPA-approved pretreatment or mini pretreatment program. First, the plant needs to know the makeup of the waste stream. A technical engineering analysis must be done. This is known as a headworks loading analysis. This must be undertaken to determine if the facility is capable of accepting the waste while continuing to meet its limits on effluent. The operators must also determine whether additional capacity to accommodate this waste exists at the plant. DEC sent a letter to all wastewater treatment plants in 2008 reminding them of the requirement to undertake these reviews and to work with DEC to ensure that they would be able to meet discharge limits and permit requirements. And we have reiterated the procedure in the SGIS. This is in our Appendix 22. DEC may modify a facility's SPEEDIES permit to allow for acceptance of this source of wastewater and include additional permit limitations and monitoring requirements associated with the wastewater to ensure compliance with all relevant standards. The SPEEDIES permit would also be modified to include limitations on the level of norm, naturally occurring radioactive material, that can be discharged to the facility to ensure that there are no effects on sludge disposal of the facility. Additionally, pretreatment would be required before material is brought to the facility. And as you know, Senators, robust enforcement authority is available to assure compliance with SPEEDIES permits. Presently, there are no plants that are authorized to accept to accept wastewater from high-volume hydraulic fracturing in New York. However, a facility dedicated to the treatment of wastewater from the drilling industry may be proposed, and existing plants may seek to address these industrial wastewaters, or other technologies could be developed to treat such wastewater as the use of this technology continues. For example, a new private facility was recently permitted to receive HVHF wastewater in Pennsylvania. So I've discussed the publicly operated treatment facilities and now mentioned the private facilities which could play an important role in this wastewater disposal process. Now, the diagram that we're showing now is obviously not legible to people in the back of this hall, but what we wanted to do, we wanted to show you the process that a publicly operated treatment plant would have to go through to get authorization from DEC to accept HVHF wastewater. It's an extremely careful, intensive process, and at each of these steps in the process, if our standards are not met, it's go back to square one. You cannot get authorization to accept this wastewater unless you satisfy all of these requirements. Moving on to the subject of solid cuttings. When a well is drilled, rock cut by the bore is returned to the surface along with any drilling fluids used. Here I'm not referring to hydraulic fluids, hydraulic fracturing fluids, but rather water or other fluids that are used to drill the well bore in the first place. The rock that comes up is known as cuttings. The fluids in this instance do not contain any additives of the type used in fracturing fluids that have raised concerns. These materials are generated well before the well is fractured, and they do not come into contact with fracturing fluids. Next slide, please. Cuttings are directed to tanks that are part of a closed-loop system, and the slide now shows on the right side such a closed-loop system. Now, it is possible to use a reserve pit, which is pictured on the left side, for cuttings and the fluids that are utilized in this very early stage, which do not contain any toxic materials. Cuttings can be disposed of on site if the drilling has been done with water or simply with air. That is, without the use of oil or polymer-based fluid or mud. If polymers or oil are used, the cuttings are considered solid waste under our regulations. However, they are eligible for disposal in an ordinary municipal solid waste landfill. Again, they do not contain the toxic materials that are associated with fracturing. Cuttings from the Marcellus Formation may contain pyrite, and the slide now refers to that substance. Pyrite is a natural mineral that is found in the Marcellus Formation and can result in acid rock that could potentially leach into groundwater. To prevent any potential leaching of acids, any on-site burial of cuttings would be permitted under our SGIS only if an acid drainage plan is submitted and approved by DEC. The plan would require management and reclamation of the impacted area of the site as well. Basically, the acid drainage plan requires that some lime or limestone or other base is used to neutralize the acid. Cuttings from the Marcellus Formation may also contain naturally occurring radioactive material or NORM, as I mentioned. This is due to the high organic content of the formation and is typically in the form of uranium, thorium, and their decay products. However, and this is what I want to stress, the concentrations of radioactivity, while somewhat elevated, are similar to those naturally encountered in the surrounding environment. Our experts have reviewed the data on the levels of NORM, as well as experts from the Department of Health, and they are confident that NORM from cuttings is not a public health concern. All wastes, including wastewater and cuttings, will be tracked using a system similar to the one that we have in place for medical waste. This will ensure that DEC can monitor the movement of waste from cradle to grave. Some members of the public have misunderstood the SGIS on this point. We are not saying that these wastes are medical waste. Rather, we are adapting a tracking procedure that was developed for medical waste for this new purpose. Also, the wastes are treated as industrial waste, and any transportation from the well pad to a disposal site must be done by a DEC permitted hauler. All of these issues are fully discussed in the SGIS. As was previously pointed out, Commissioner Martens has recently extended the comment period for the draft SGIS and proposed regulations through January 11th. We encourage the public to provide us with detailed comments on waste disposal, on the mitigation measures that we have proposed, as well as all the other issues that have been raised by this subject. Last, I want to stress that it is important that proper oversight and enforcement of all aspects of gas drilling, including the management of waste, be provided. This is key to ensuring protection of public health and the environment. Commissioner Martens has convened an advisory panel on HVHF, which was tasked with developing recommendations on state and local resource needs to properly oversee, monitor, and enforce conditions for HVHF in New York. We expect those recommendations to be issued sometime in 2012. Thank you. I am happy to answer any questions you may have and appreciate your interest and engagement on this important issue.
Thank you, Deputy Commissioner. Naturally, we do have quite a few questions. If you can go back to the slide that showed the open pit, the one on the left where it's got a reserve pad. Now, you're saying that that is basically just for cuttings. Is that correct?
That's for cuttings and the fluid that's used to drill the well initially, yes.
Which has no contact prior with fracking fluids?
That's correct.
Okay. Now, isn't it true that in Pennsylvania, let's say, in the past, that there was those holding ponds that were holding waters for fracking fluid?
I believe there were holding impoundments for fracking fluid that had been utilized and was flowing back to the surface, and
Okay.
that is what we are not permitting under the SGIS.
Okay, so we're clear. So as far as those open pits that may have fracking fluids and what may have happened in Pennsylvania, some of those lined ponds may have had cracks where you had this fluid leaking into potential well sites. The buffer zone may not have been at a distance that New York has that would create some of those problems with regards to some people living in those areas. Is that correct?
Yes, that is correct, Senator.
What can you explain briefly what the difference is between what the DEC is doing with regards to the fracking fluid and the cuttings as compared to what was done in Pennsylvania?
As you know, Senator, there were a series of articles in the New York Times that discussed that subject. And what the Times pointed out was that fluids of the type that we've discussed, flowback water and production brine, were taken in Pennsylvania to treatment facilities. There was no report indicating that pre-treatment was required at those facilities. We would require pre-treatment. There was no indication that a headworks analysis was conducted at those facilities. We would require that type of analysis. Only after all those diamonds in the process that we outlined have been satisfied would a facility in New York be able to do anything of the nature that was that was done in Pennsylvania. And so the result of what was done in Pennsylvania was that there were reports that contaminants actually went through the treatment facilities, had not been stopped or eliminated by the facility, and actually entered receiving waters, where in fact drinking water may have been extracted. That process would not occur in New York State because the treatment facility would be violating its permit by discharging contaminants in that manner. With respect to cuttings as well, I'm not aware that Pennsylvania had an acid drainage requirement. We would also impose careful requirements on the acceptance by our municipal landfills of cuttings to make sure that high levels of radioactivity do not exist in those landfills. In fact, we are proposing, and the SGIS points this out, a specific limit on the radioactive reading of any cuttings. It's a 15 picocuries per gram limit, which is well below what the studies indicate is the level at which any risk would occur.
Okay. Now, you know that we recently passed in the Senate and also in the state a water withdrawal bill and water withdrawal regulation.
Yes.
And due to the large amounts of water that may be required to frack some of these wells, what are some of the steps that are taken in order to comply with that particular avenue with regards to the water withdrawal bill?
For the HVHF process, we have identified specific ecological limits on the withdrawal of water from our rivers, streams, and other sources. We're requiring very careful measurements to be taken to make sure that the amount of water extracted does not reduce the flow in those streams to levels that become harmful to the biota, the animals, the invertebrates, etc., who rely on those streams.
And the, I mean, we know in the past that the DEC has been severely cut. as far as with the number of people, the people that are able to do any sort of permitting, inspectors, so on and so forth. Is it the plan either through the DEC or through legislation, because it's something that I'm for, to make sure that if this procedure is to go forward, that the cost for the permitting or any sort of cost is earmarked to the DEC to be able to hire additional staff, to be hire additional people to look at these permitting processes, to do the inspections, to have testing done of the wells, both prior, during, and after any of these well pads are put into place. Is that something that in the SGIS report has been talked about to move forward to strengthen the DEC so it can have a handle on this and not have things slip by?
As you know, the commissioner has convened an advisory panel and tasked it to look at the staffing levels that will be required to do the various important tasks that you just mentioned, Senator, and to identify specific revenue sources that would be earmarked to pay for that additional staff. The commissioner has said if we don't receive that revenue for that purpose, we will simply not issue any permits that we cannot adequately monitor. And so we need the cooperation of the Senate and the other arms of the government to make sure that that adequate staffing is funded.
Now, you mentioned that as of right now, there is no facility in New York that can handle any flowback water. Is that correct?
They are not presently authorized to do so. They could possibly, if they do the adequate study, they may well have the ability to do it with minor modification to their facility. It would depend on a review of each individual facility, and those that would require some new construction or modification of their process would have to do that work in order to accept those fluids.
And you're saying at the present time in Pennsylvania, there's a private facility that has recently surfaced that is doing that.
That's
Prior
correct.
to that, they were sending the flowback water to Ohio to dispose of it in wells?
As well as sending some of the water to their own publicly operated treatment plants.
Any idea on the cost of creating a private facility to treat the hydraulic fracturing fluid, what the cost would be on a private facility?
I don't know the answer to that, but I'm convinced that those investors and those corporations that went ahead did that calculation and determined that it was a profit-making operation.
Okay. Now, one of the things that people talk about is hazardous waste, or some of the waste that may be in this flowback. Do you know, or are you able to tell us how the hazardous waste is classified or regulated in New York State now?
Many of the same precautions that we apply to hazardous waste are applied under the SGIS to some of the wastes generated from this process. In general, if hazardous waste has been generated, it must go to a designated type of landfill or other disposal facility. We have been very careful about identifying what needs to go to such a special facility and what can, from the hydrofracking process, go to a municipal solid waste landfill. The key is we looked at the particular wastes here and their characteristics and have adopted the measures that are necessary for this particular waste stream in all its different forms.
Okay, and in the SGIS, it talks about protocols of disclosing what the chemicals are in the water. Is that correct?
That's correct.
Okay.
And if I may add, in order for a treatment facility to accept wastes of this kind, they would have to be informed of precisely what is in the wastewater, including the additives that have been used in the fracturing process.
Okay. Now, you talked about that you're going to track this as if it was, I'm not saying it is medical waste, but what made you go by that particular procedure of from cradle to the grave of tracking this as if it were medical waste? Is it just that there's a procedure in place already right now?
Well, it was obvious to us that there was a concern about proper disposal, and we want to have the ability to verify that all the waste that's generated from this process has been properly disposed of.
And when we saw that site about a open a loop system and a closed loop system, what does a DEC prefer, actually, a closed system?
Well, we have authorized for the cuttings either the open or the closed.
Okay.
So,
and that's based on the DEC and others that have basically stated that in those cuttings that there's not any hazardous materials.
That's correct. Now, there is the potential for higher levels of radioactivity, and that is going to be monitored when those materials are then brought to a landfill.
Okay. A landfill that's designated to handle that.
That's correct.
Okay. Now, do you know if we're receiving any of this material from Pennsylvania and disposing it in landfills here?
At the present time, I don't believe that the wastewater from Pennsylvania is being disposed of in New York State, and I'm not aware. Yes, there are cuttings that have been accepted in the Chemung landfill, but I'm not sure whether they originated in Pennsylvania or New York.
Okay. And are those cuttings the same cuttings that we're referring to that do not have, or they may have a higher radioactive material, but you're saying it's not enough to, in your studies, to cause health concerns?
That is exactly right.
And at the present time, I mean, there's no hydrofracking wells, no permits have been issued.
For high-volume hydrofracking,
Right.
That's correct. There is, and has for a considerable amount of time, been hydraulic fracturing in lower volume of water uses, vertical wells, and that has been conducted without any significant problems of any nature.
Okay. Well, let's touch on that for a minute, because I know that the EPA in Wyoming County came out with a site-specific problem with one of the, I'm assuming it was a vertical well there in Wyoming County that had some issues. Wyoming State. What was the difference that would be different between New York and what they did in Wyoming State?
Well, the report issued by EPA last week on Pavilion, Wyoming was really shocking in indicating the poor practices with respect to the cementing of the wellbore used in Wyoming. There were instances where there was inadequate cement around the pipe or casing that's used to get down into the formation. Now, that's a very serious problem, because whatever materials, such as the fluids used in hydraulic fracturing or gas itself that may be in the subsurface, can then move alongside the casing up to the shallow areas. And EPA hasn't reached a conclusion yet about whether that was the precise cause, but there was contamination of drinking water in Wyoming. The EPA said it may have been due to the insufficient cement. It may have been due to the permeability of the rock in those locations, and I might say in New York State, in the vicinity of the Marcellus Shale, we have very different geology, less permeable than was present in Wyoming. And it may, they thought, have been due to the creation of fractures that extended up into the shallow drinking water areas. One of the crucial differences in New York is that we will not issue a permit under the SGIS for any drilling proposed to be closer than 2,000 feet below the ground surface. What they had in Wyoming in this instance was drilling at 1,200 feet below the ground surface. And there was only a separation of a few hundred feet between the drilling process that was going on and the drinking water wells. Under our SGIS, there must be at least 1,000 feet of separation, and that's a very big difference.
So basically, it's the depth and as well as the casings, which I know in Pennsylvania they would have a layer of steel and a layer of concrete, and in New York they're talking about having a triple layer under the SGIS report. It's something, at a topic that was at another hearing. It kind of goes below the scope, but that's basically the difference between Pennsylvania and New York.
Yes, it is.
Okay. Now,
and if I could add, in connection with your earlier question, Senator, the need for staff comes into play here. We want our staff from our regional office in this area to be out at the well pad to check that cementing, to make absolutely certain that it's been done. In Pennsylvania, they didn't send staff to do that. And we have proposed to the advisory panel several key points in the process at which we have to have DEC staff at the well pad.
Okay. Now, one of the other areas that is asked about or questions are sent about with regards to this water is the potential for either spills or trucking accidents or something along those lines. And I know the SGI has touched on this a little bit. What do you plan on proposing with regards to either the prevention of these spills or potential for trucking accidents with regards to this fluid?
Well, any transporter, as I mentioned, must be permitted under our existing regulations. So there are very careful requirements, as well as DOT regulations on transporters of material of this nature. There will also have to be a transportation plan submitted by the operator of a well pad that indicates the routes that are to be used for transportation, and that would be subject to our approval as well. We also recognize that there could be a need to amplify the local spill response staffs that exist, and the advisory panel is going to consider that and determine whether special revenue needs to be raised in part for that purpose as well.
They talk about the brine water being used on some roads for de-icing, and you've heard of that. I mean, is that an appropriate way to reuse this fracking water, or is it regulated, or is it something that is considered?
Well, let me distinguish between the two types of water that we referred to earlier. The flowback water would not be permitted for that road spreading use. We are open to the possibility, depending on the particular characteristics of the production brine. There is a potential that the radioactivity would be low enough and the other constituents of the production brine would be sufficiently low that upon review of all the data, we would make an individual determination that a particular quantity of production brine could be used in road spreading, only after its safety has been verified.
Now, there's and I know you don't have a chance to look at it, but you said it was interesting enough. That came out of RIT, and it's something that is being run through other colleges as well, and that's that airborne remote sensing technology that we talked about that would actually be able to sense not only air, but the technology is so advanced for well site development, particularly flowback waste, rapid assessments of any impact of surface or near surface releases. And I take it that's something that I believe it's been submitted, but that's something that seems to be another avenue of assurances for the public, for the environment and protecting the environment. Would you agree? I know you just had a chance to look at it briefly, but
it is possible that this could become a component of the precautions that are taken. It appears that what our IT is doing here is still in a prototype or pilot phase, research and development, and is not ready to be deployed. But certainly anything that like this that could contribute to the protection of groundwater and air would be looked at very carefully.
Well, I'm gonna go over my notes a little bit here that I made. I know that Senator Gallivan may have some questions, so I'll turn the mic over to him at this point in time.
Thank you, Chairman. I do have several questions, Commissioner, and I'm going to bounce around just a little bit. If we could go back to you mentioned Chemung County as a recipient of, you believe, cuttings, although you don't know what their source is. Why is that?
Why?
Yeah, why don't you know what the source of the materials is?
Well, I don't have that information with me today, but we have very carefully reviewed the Chemung County situation. In fact, Commissioner Martens issued a lengthy opinion or decision in an administrative proceeding relating to it, and it certainly has all that information in it.
So in the permitting process for the landfills, is that something that's required when the various trucks are bringing in the materials? They're required to identify where they came from?
Yes, they are. Yes, they are.
Okay, thank you. Now you mentioned, we talked about the cuttings, and we've talked about how they've been analyzed, and they don't rise to the level of producing any public health concerns. For the layperson like me, what is that level, and how do you get to that point, and what then puts them over the edge that would make them a public health concern?
Well, there was a study by the Argonne National Lab that generated a level of 50 picocuries per gram, which is the unit for measuring radioactivity of this type. And at that 50 level, there was some evidence to support a risk of health impacts. What we have done is work back from that level to make sure we don't get close to it. And so we will make sure that the levels that go into a landfill or go into a wastewater treatment facility are well below that, a fraction of that. And if I may, this is the basic method that we utilize to set standards for air pollution, and I'm just not talking just about DEC, but EPA, all the states, air pollution, water pollution. We have studies that indicate what the level at which you may see a health impact is, and we work back from that to limit emissions into the air, discharges into the water. In all cases, we make sure that the levels that we're permitting are well below the level at which some study indicates a possible health threat.
Do you regularly test that or monitor that at the different landfills? And let's be specific with Chemung. I mean, which I understand it's part of how you treat other materials.
There will be monitoring of that nature, yes.
But is there now?
There is at the Chemung landfill, yes.
Do we have to be concerned about the cumulative impacts of the radiation? I mean, meaning the volume, not the individual content of each load that's brought.
It could be an issue if a landfill asked us for permission to create a separate part of the landfill that was only taking fracking cuttings. In that case, what we call a monofill, you might get such a concentration of this material that the normal limitation would be exceeded. But what we're looking at Chemung and what we expect at these landfills generally is that the cuttings will be stored, will be disposed and placed with municipal solid waste and commercial waste of all types, and that we will not have that type of cumulative effect.
Is the designation of these cuttings as industrial waste, was that something that was designated prior to our concerns in New York State?
Well, that's a designation that we adopted that has been in place for under our solid waste regulations for many years, and when we address this particular waste stream, it appeared that this was the suitable category to address and regulate this waste stream.
I've heard conflicting reports / rumors. I haven't seen anything in print, so I don't know. But what about in Pennsylvania? Do they still receive these cuttings in their landfills? I had received some information that Pennsylvania might no longer be allowing this disposal.
I had heard that the treatment facilities were no longer accepting the waste from the wastewater, but I believe that was not a binding directive.
I'm asking about the cuttings.
And I don't recall any similar restriction being imposed with respect to the cuttings in Pennsylvania.
But you're not completely aware.
But I'm not certain.
Which is okay. With the cutting, what's being received in Chemung County and maybe in some other places in the state, I might understand correctly that it is just solids?
That's correct. They cannot accept wastewater.
Okay, thanks. Let me move to the medical waste tracking system, mostly because I'm not familiar with it. Are you able to take us through the process? I mean, you're going to use a process similar to the medical waste tracking system?
It will be similar. There will be special forms.
Can you take us through the steps?
Yes. Upon the generation of waste at the well pad, the operator of the well pad would be required to fill out a DEC form specifying what the nature of the waste is, the volume, and the characteristics of the waste. Similarly, when the waste was transferred to a hauler, the operator of the truck would be required to also fill out a waste form documenting the same types of information. Upon delivery of the waste to a facility for disposal, the operator of the facility would have to fill out a form as well. All of these forms would be required to be retained by those individuals, those entities, and DEC would have the ability to review at any point any of those documents to verify that all of the requirements of the regulations and SGIS have been satisfied.
I mentioned at the beginning, my district included Livingston County as well, and if you remember going back a number of years, there was a mine collapse, a salt mine collapse, and what came out of that was some ongoing testing and treatment of the brine water. Well, a year or so ago, I visited a plant, a water treatment plant in Livingston County, and they indicated that they were involved in, I may not be terming it right, a demonstration project, an experimental type project, where under the auspices of the DEC, they treated 300,000 gallons of fracking water that came up from Pennsylvania. I have several questions. First, is that accurate? Or is it accurate? Secondly, if it is, what were the results of that, if you know?
Well, we are aware that there was hydraulic fracturing fluid that was received in Canandaigua, perhaps, I'm not sure which facility you're referring to, but there were about 6 facilities that we are aware accepted vertical drilling wastewater. I'm not aware of any high-volume hydraulic fracturing wastewater from any location, any state, that was accepted in New York, and we don't believe that was the case. But we are not aware of any violation that occurred in connection with those earlier examples of treatment of wastewater from vertical processes.
When those 6 plants that were accepting the wastewater,
Yes.
was that done in conjunction with DEC, or is that something they were doing on their own?
Well, they are required to report to DEC, and frankly, I don't know the history of each of those instances, and I can't verify what the interaction with the agency was at that time.
Can you, going back to the wastewater, the cuttings, I've reviewed the report. I don't have 1,100 pages committed to memory, though, so forgive me. But can you talk about some of the specific enforcement activities as it relates to the byproduct? I mean, site visits, physically people sitting there looking at pieces of paper. How much will they be on site? Assuming you have the necessary resources for that. I certainly understand that it's very clear you don't have the resources now to properly regulate any type of activities in the calling upon the legislature to fund it. So assume you had sufficient resources for just this exercise. Can you take us through some of the regulatory activities related to the water and the cuttings?
With respect to the water, we would verify the integrity of the system that was transmitting the water from the wellbore to the tanks. We would verify, we had seen in the slide, the blue tanks that would store this water. There has to be piping that has to be secure from the wellbore to these tanks. We'd check to make sure all of that was intact. There has to be secondary containment or barriers around these tanks. We would ascertain that the secondary containment was properly constructed and that it was intact. There would be monitoring of the transfer from these tanks to the trucks. Not every truck, obviously, but there would be some inspection of that nature. That would all be done at the well pad. But at the publicly operated treatment work, certainly all of the processes that I mentioned of review of data would be conducted, and we would have to ascertain on site that any conditions or modifications of the permit for those facilities were being observed and properly applied in the field. With respect to the cuttings, it would be important to verify that the cuttings were properly transferred to the landfill and that the measurements were being taken to ensure that high levels of radioactivity were not permitted in those landfills. Those are just some of the many steps that would be taken.
Can you go back to the slide that showed the closed and open loop? I know you touched on this just a bit, but my last question has to do with the open loop system and the reserve pit. What happens at the very end? So the drilling has taken place. Eventually, this whole area gets closed up and people move on and drill somewhere else. But what happens with what's in that pit? And how do we make sure that that's not a concern?
Well, that pit has to be closed in a short time frame. I don't have the days, but it's in those 1,100 pages. And within that number of days, after the usage has ceased, that will have to be also disposed of, and that requires very careful measurement as well. If there is a residue at the bottom of the pit that has concentrated the characteristics in the cuttings. For example, it's possible you could have a higher level of radioactivity at that point. Then that material, that residue, would have to be taken to a low-level radioactive waste facility, and there are such permitted facilities, or to a special facility for under our RECRA, federal RECRA laws. Similarly, the lining would have to be disposed of, again, depending on its characteristics. And the water, any remaining water, of course, would have to be disposed of as well.
Okay, thank you.
And staying with that, is the lining itself, I mean, what sort of requirements are there with regards to the lining? Because if you're talking about a concentration that could potentially mean a higher level of radiation, which, if it's not concentrated, or saying it's not a health concern, but it is possible to concentrate in an area towards the end stages of it. What procedures or requirements are there with regards to the lining that we saw in Pennsylvania was a problem where it would either split or crack, and then that particular fluid would leak out into the public and into the community, where whether it's fracking fluid or not, if it has concentrated levels of radiation, that could be a concern. So what are the requirements that they're talking about with regards to that?
I believe what our SGIS says about that issue is that our existing regulations under our solid waste facility law must be applied to the construction of the liner and the pit. And that our regulations are extremely stringent on that score and are designed to ensure that no liquid can pass through the liner. And I might add that there's a requirement to make sure that the rock is disposed in a manner that the rock itself doesn't jeopardize the integrity of that liner.
And you were when Senator Gallivan asked you the question, monitoring whether it's pipes or what have you from this flowback well, that same I take procedure would be in place when these facilities are either recycling, reusing the process for the wastewater. There's got to be monitoring. I'm sure of that. When you have the flowback come back, these companies are reusing some of this fluid. Is it the same procedure to make sure that whether it's in pipes, there's no leaking? There's how is that regulated by the DEC as well? And like I said, you probably don't have enough people to do that, which is I'm happy to hear that you're saying, well, we're not going to issue as many permits until we have a strength of people to monitor these particular situations. But that seems to be and one of the reasons why we're having this particular hearing is focusing on the water, is that there was a concern in some areas in Pennsylvania that even though you're recycling and reusing this water, some of it has a potential of still leaking or spilling, and that's something that you don't want to have happen. So is that what you were talking about with regards to Senator Gallivan's question as far as making sure that these pipes are sealed and everything else?
That's certainly the general type of concern. Commissioner Martens was asked by the governor to go to Pennsylvania and visit the site where we were all shocked to hear, I believe it was May, possibly April of this year, there was a serious incident at a well pad. This was in the township of Leroy in Bradford County. And one thing that occurred that contributed to that incident was that the berm or wall surrounding the well pad had not been properly constructed, or at least it was not constructed in a way that would withstand the kind of very heavy rains that had occurred over that period of time. And what happened was that corner of the well pad sloughed down, and that barrier or berm no longer operated. So there was, in addition, a mistake made at the well itself that resulted in fluids being pouring out of the wellbore. They would have been contained by that barrier, but it had not been built sufficiently to withstand the heavy rains. And so we're going to make sure that these well pads are inspected to make sure they are capable of withstanding the conditions they're going to be subjected to. And it's very important that all parts of the process be checked out before these operations occur.
You mentioned the weather. It brings up a couple of things in mind. Can you touch briefly on the stormwater controls that you're talking about in the SGIS report, as well as the flood zones, which could be a problem, especially what just happened recently with a tropical storm that hit part of the area in the southern tier and along the east coast, where there could be a problem. Can you touch on those for us a little bit?
Certainly. With respect to the flooding, the SGIS, even in its draft form before those serious hurricane and tropical storm occurred, placed the flood plains out of eligibility for well pads using this process. So there will be no well pads in the 100-year floodplain. We also were concerned to find out what happened in Pennsylvania. So we made inquiries with the Pennsylvania Department of Environmental Protection, and apparently the industry got warnings of the impending storms and made sure that their operations were secure. And in fact, there were no incidents that were relayed to us by the state of Pennsylvania, the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania, indicating any accident or spillage or flooding that compromised the environment or public health as a result of those storms in Pennsylvania, which was very good news. But we are continuing to analyze that issue. I want to make clear, not only are we continuing to accept comments, we're still looking at all of the issues to see if there's anything else that needs to be done here to make sure that we have fully protected drinking water and air and our land. And what was the first part of your question,
On the
Senator?
stormwater controls.
Yes. We are requiring a special permit for stormwater. It will be a general permit for hydraulic fracturing. It will specify, and we've published at the same time as the September draft of the SGIS, we published what that permit would look like. And we invited comment on that as well. There we're addressing issues such as runoff of sediment from the construction of the well pad, construction of the roads, and specified many of the precautions that have to be taken, which are very similar to the precautions that we require at any building site.
Okay. Now, you touched on this a little bit with regards to Senator Gallivan's question with the closing of a drilling site or a pad, and will the DEC require post-drilling water quality test or water samples or water supplies near the drilling site? Is that something that that you're going to take care of, or is the industry going to have a burden on that, or who's going to take care of that?
Well, we're requiring monitoring of drinking water wells on a periodic basis.
Okay. The
And that, by the way, would be done at the expense of the industry.
At the expense of the industry, okay.
That's correct.
The in Ohio, they talk about these disposable wells being utilized to dump this fluid in Ohio. Is that something that was looked at here in New York? Is that something that's feasible, pumping the water deep into the ground? Do you feel it's safe? Something that we're not going to look at in New York? We're not interested in doing anything along those lines?
We would take a look at any proposal of that nature, but there are limitations. I'm not fully versed in what the geological concerns are with respect to that, but we have not ruled it out. It has apparently not been as easy to do a suitable deep injection well in New York State as it is in Ohio, for example.
Okay. All right. So it's something that's not on the table right now. You would rather find other methods, other alternatives?
It's something that is a possibility that we would have to look at.
Okay. And, this is a topic that the flowback water itself and some of the production waste, it's not classified as hazardous waste and or regulated as such. Are there other chemicals that are exempt from that particular title? I mean, I'm just trying to figure out why the DEC decided not to classify flowback or some of this production as hazardous, as some people are pushing for in Senate language or so on and so forth, as if you're classifying this as hazardous waste, it's got to be treated completely different than and just sending it to a facility.
Well, I believe it was the federal government that made that initial decision, and that several years ago, that once that decision was made with respect to federal regulation, that our own regulatory process was conformed to the federal practice. Part of the reason for that is that we operate state regulatory programs as delegated programs from the federal government, and to the extent we do that, we're required to follow the federal government's rules.
Gotcha. Did you have anything further?
Yes, Commissioner. I have one more question, and it goes back to the the regulation and the tracking of whether it's the cuttings or the wastewater, and the comparison is made to medical waste? And you may have answered, and I'm just not clear on this. So we're keeping track of the materials as they're moved along from the site to wherever they go, to the treatment facility, to disposal. Similar, in my language of the law enforcement background, a chain of custody of the materials.
Mm-hmm.
So their DEC regulators then take the paperwork and they look at it, and they see that it's properly filled out after everything is completed, right?
We're not going to do that for every single shipment. We have the ability to request or inspect and request copies of that material, but we're not going to routinely collect all of those records.
Understood, but it's available, and then when it's looked
That's
at,
correct.
we say that, yes, this was handled properly from
That's
cradle to
correct.
grave.
That's correct.
But here's the question that I'm getting at. What if they don't properly dispose of it?
Mm-hmm.
Is there any check from somebody just lying on the sheet of paper or crumpling it up and throwing it in the garbage? So we know when it lands somewhere in the grave, there's a chain of custody. And you look at the paperwork and you can see all of it. What if somebody takes something and dumps it wherever they want, and this is thrown in the garbage?
As you know, Senator, there are opportunities to commit crimes in all aspects of our society. We have criminal laws on illegal disposal of hazardous waste. The waste that is not exempt from hazardous waste regulation could just as easily be disposed as in a midnight dumping situation. And what we've done, as you know, for many years, is to create imprisonment and significant fines for anyone who commits such a crime. And one of the things we are projecting is the need for more staff in our law enforcement division. We need environmental conservation officers who are out in the field spotting those examples of criminal behavior. And it's no different from any other environmentally risky substance in our society. Those criminal actions are theoretically possible, but we have to enforce and punish any activity of that nature.
Let me ask a slightly different way. Do we know, through the proposed regulations and this particular process, that a site, these aren't real numbers, produces 1 million gallons of something? 1 million gallons of wastewater, for sake of discussion. Do we know that?
Yes.
I mean, through the proposed regulations and various audits, you're able to determine that right at the site?
They are required to record the volume of water that they send for disposal. I cannot tell you myself, but I could find out whether they're required to keep a log in general of all the volumes that are generated by the well.
So we know some wastewater would go for disposal, some will be recycled.
Yes, the large...
Is there any other places that water can go?
Well, if we're talking about water that's generated up out of the pipe, that can either be reused or disposed of. That's correct.
Okay. Do the companies, the drilling companies, have to keep track of what is recycled? So if you do an audit, should they have somewhere on paper what is disposed of, what is recycled, and that should equal 100%?
I don't know the answer to that question, whether we are requiring the volume reused on the site.
Okay. What I'm getting at is, at the site, if somehow through audits, through the regulations, through the paperwork, if you have the ability to know all the wastewater being produced or all the cuttings being produced, and doing it at the other end, having a mechanism at the other end by checking the company's paperwork to match it up so that 1 million equals 1 million, wherever it was, whether it's recycled, whether it's properly disposed of.
We will have the records of the volumes of cuttings, the volume of wastewater that is sent for disposal, and we will have access to the records of the receiving facilities. And we could make that comparison, yes.
Do the haulers of the materials have to be permitted as well?
Yes, they do.
By the DEC?
They do, yes.
When they're permitted, are they permitted, do they have to identify specifically where they're going? For instance, is a hauler permitted to go to 3 different facilities or able to go to any permitted facility or site?
First, the permit I was referring to is a standing permit that they get that is good for a lengthy period of time. They don't need to come to us for a permit for each waste disposal trip. Once they've got their standing permit, then they're required to keep the records of each trip that we referred to earlier as being similar to what the records in the medical waste area are.
And the obligation is on the hauler to properly dispose of it.
That's correct.
But then, of course, that gets backed up by them keeping records to indicate such.
That's correct, and that's subject to penalties under our state law if there is a discrepancy or a disposal that is not proper under our regulations or the SGIS conditions. Those haulers would be subject to penalties, including high fines and revocation of their permit.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome, Senator.
Just last question. Do we know how Pennsylvania is classifying their flowback water? Are they classifying it as hazardous, or are they following the federal model as well?
They follow the federal model.
Okay, all right. I have nothing further. I want to thank you for providing the information with regards to for this particular hearing and answering our questions. As I said, we're trying to have them very pointed to specific topics, but I know that in the SGIS, certain specific things regarding water and what's happening, I think we're kind of just a little bit of a broad stroke, but I think now, some of the questions that I had with regards to that, I appreciate your candid and truthful answers with regards to such, and I appreciate the fact that the DEC has decided to extend the comment period to January 11th to give more input. So. And I appreciate you driving down here and taking the time, and thank you for your testimony.
You're welcome. Thank you. Thank you very much.